Have you ever noticed how lighthouses always seem to stand apart from the world, as if they exist in their own dimension of time and space? I've been a lighthouse keeper for 20 years now, and I can tell you with certainty, there's something about these towers that draws more than just ships to their light. I'm writing this account not to warn you, but to confess what happened during my final days at Oransay Lighthouse. Maybe then you'll understand why Scotland's last manually operated lighthouse now stands abandoned, its beam forever dark against the northern sky. The path to Oransay Lighthouse was treacherous even in the daylight. The narrow trail snaked along the jagged cliffs, with loose stones skittering down into the dark waves below. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its once bright red and white stripes faded to a pale pink and dull gray, battered by decades of salt and wind. Its beam sliced through the mist in rhythmic sweeps, a steady reminder of its purpose, to guide lost ships to safety, or to warn them away from destruction. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached, each step bringing me closer to what would become my home for the foreseeable future. The Maritime Board had been surprisingly eager to fill this position, despite the remote location and the mysterious departure of the previous keeper. They'd practically thrust the keys into my hands, along with a hastily printed manual of operations that looked decades out of date. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the cramped entryway. The air was damp and smelled faintly of seaweed, rust, and something sharper, like copper. An old oilskin coat hung by the door, stiff with age and still damp to the touch. A pair of muddy boots sat beneath it, far too large to be mine. Something about their positioning made them look as if their owner had simply vanished while wearing them, leaving them behind like an abandoned shell. Inside, the lighthouse was a monument to isolation. The narrow spiral staircase wound upward, each step groaning under my weight, as if protesting this intrusion into its solitude. Water stains marked the walls in strange patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The keeper's office, a small room on the second floor, was cluttered with remnants of the past. A brass telescope with cracked lenses, nautical charts yellowed with age, and a dusty barometer that still ticked faintly, though its needle never moved. It was there, beneath the desk, that I discovered the rules. The etchings were crude, jagged as though carved in desperation. The wood splintered around each letter, as if the writer had used something other than a proper tool. My fingers traced the words, their meanings sinking in like cold water. The rules. Rule 1. Never leave the lighthouse after sunset. Rule 2. If the foghorn blows more than 3 times, do not look out the windows. Rule 3. Always clean the lantern glass before dusk. Any smudge could let them in. Rule 4. If you hear knocking on the door after midnight, do not answer. No one will come this far at that hour. Rule 5. Once a month, leave an offering of fresh bread and milk on the cliff's edge at sunrise. Do not look back while walking away. Rule 6. If the light goes out between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., stay absolutely still until it comes back on. Rule 7. Never touch the old logbook in the drawer under the desk. Rule 8. If you hear your own voice calling to you from outside, do not respond. It is not you. I stared at the carvings, the words pressing heavily into my mind. It must have been a joke, some sick prank by the previous keeper. But the raw edges of the letters, the deep gouges in the wood, it didn't feel like a joke. Some of the grooves still held traces of what looked like rust, but the coppery smell that rose from them made me think of something else entirely. The unease followed me as I climbed to the lantern room. The massive lens turned slowly, its prisms catching and splitting the late afternoon light into rainbow fragments that danced across the walls. As I cleaned the glass, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. In the reflection of the lens, I could have sworn I saw movement behind me, but when I turned, there was only the empty room and the endless sea beyond. By the second night, the lighthouse felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind seemed amplified, as though the building itself was breathing. The day had been spent maintaining the foghorn, my hands covered in grease as I checked its mechanisms and oil levels. It was an ancient beast of brass and iron, its fittings tarnished and green with corrosion, but somehow it still worked. The Maritime Board had mentioned it was scheduled for automated replacement next year. Now I understood why no one had bothered to modernize it. Some things are better left untouched. I'd established a routine, checking the weather instruments, recording readings in the new logbook, not the old one, never the old one, and watching the horizon for approaching vessels. The isolation was beginning to sink in. My phone had no signal here, and the satellite internet was temperamental at best. The only constant companion was the rhythmic sweep of the light above and the distant crash of waves below. That night, the fog rolled in thick and fast, consuming the cliffs and sea, until the world outside became a blank canvas of gray. I was in the office reviewing maintenance schedules when the foghorn blared its first warning, its mournful call reverberating through the lighthouse's bones. Once. The sound shook dust from the rafters. Twice. My coffee cup rattled against its saucer. 3 times. Normal procedure. Warning ships of the treacherous rocks below. I relaxed, reaching for my lukewarm coffee. But then came the 4th blast. The sound was wrong, longer, shriller, as though the foghorn itself were screaming in terror. My hand froze halfway to my cup, the rules burning in my mind. If the foghorn blows more than 3 times, do not look out the windows. My instincts fought with my curiosity. The rational part of my brain said there must be a mechanical fault, something I'd missed during maintenance. But something deeper, more primal, whispered that looking outside would be the last mistake I'd ever make. The stillness between blasts was absolute. No wind, no waves. Even the usual creaks of the lighthouse had fallen silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The 5th blast shattered the quiet like a hammer through glass. I turned toward the window, my body moving before my mind could stop it. Through the thick fog, shapes moved, tall, spindly figures that seemed to ripple like waves. Their outlines were barely visible, but their movements were wrong. Too smooth, too fast, as though they were gliding rather than walking. One of them stopped directly in my line of sight, turning toward the lighthouse. Though I couldn't make out any features in the gray murk, I knew with bone-deep certainty that it could see me. A high-pitched keening filled my ears as I slammed the shutters closed and backed away, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The foghorn fell silent, its echo dying away into nothing. But then came a new sound. The soft, deliberate scratch of something sharp against wood, tracing slow patterns on the outside of the shutters. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the office, my back pressed against the wall, listening to that methodical scratching. When dawn finally came, I forced myself to check the shutters. Deep grooves marked the wood in elaborate swirling patterns that almost looked like words in a language I couldn't read and didn't want to understand. The fog had retreated with the morning light, but as I looked out across the calm sea, I couldn't shake the feeling that those figures were still out there, waiting for me to break another rule. The third day dawned gray and overcast, the kind of morning where the line between sea and sky blurred into a single sheet of slate. I'd barely slept, my dreams filled with the echo of that endless scratching and glimpses of impossibly tall figures moving through fog. My morning coffee tasted like ash in my mouth. The air was thick with the smell of salt and wet earth as I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though something was trying to keep me from reaching the top. The light's steady sweep was my only comfort now, a beacon of normalcy in the chaos the night had brought. Rule 3 echoed in my mind. Always clean the lantern glass before dusk. Any smudge could let them in. I was halfway through my usual cleaning routine when I noticed it. At first, it looked like a simple smear on the glass, the kind left by seabirds or salt spray. But as I moved closer, my stomach dropped through the floor. It wasn't just a smudge. It was a handprint. The print was skeletal, each finger impossibly long and thin, stretching nearly 2 feet from palm to tip. The worst part was its location. On the outside of the glass, hundreds of feet above the rocks, where no human could possibly reach without extensive climbing gear. The fingers seemed to ripple slightly in the morning light, as though they were still wet, still fresh. My throat constricted as I forced myself to clean it, the cloth trembling in my hand. The smudge resisted at first, smearing rather than wiping away. It felt cold under the cloth, colder than the surrounding glass, and seemed to leave faint trails of frost in its wake. When it finally disappeared, I could have sworn I heard a soft sigh from outside. Back in the office, I tried to calm my nerves with another cup of coffee. That's when I saw it. Another handprint, this time on the inside of the window by the desk. It was smaller than the one upstairs, but the fingers were still unnaturally elongated. As I stared at it, my blood turning to ice, I realized something that made my heart stop. It was still being formed, the glass slowly frosting over in the shape of a skeletal hand, as though something invisible was pressing against it from my side of the window. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The handprint completed itself with agonizing slowness, and then, as I watched, a single fingertip began to move, scratching 4 words into the frost. "We see you, James." The Maritime Board's manual said nothing about this. Nothing about handprints that appeared from nowhere. Nothing about foghorns that screamed into the night. Nothing about the rules carved into the desk. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But the screen showed only static, and through the speaker came a sound like waves, and beneath them, distant laughter. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the window again, the handprint and its message had vanished, leaving no trace on the glass. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something that shocked me to my core. My own reflection seemed slightly out of sync with my movements, its eyes meeting mine a fraction of a second too late. I spent the rest of the day checking and rechecking every window in the lighthouse, cleaning each pane until my arms ached. But I couldn't shake the feeling that with each smudge I removed, I was somehow giving them exactly what they wanted. Another clean surface to reach through, another clear path into my world. The wind picked up as evening approached, battering the lighthouse with gusts that made the walls shudder and moan. I sat at the desk, pretending to focus on the maintenance logs while my mind wandered back to the handprints, the figures in the fog, the rules that seemed more like prayers against the darkness than regulations. My dinner sat untouched beside me, a sad affair of canned beans and stale bread. The isolation was starting to wear on me. 4 days since I'd spoken to another human being. 4 days of nothing but the wind, the waves, and the increasingly unsettling sounds that echoed through the lighthouse's hollow spaces. I glanced at my watch. 11:58 p.m. The rules had made me obsessive about time. In a place like this, minutes could mean the difference between safety and whatever fate had befallen the previous keeper. Then it started. The sound was so clear, so deliberate, that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. 3 perfect knocks, evenly spaced, as though someone was keeping time. I checked my watch again. 12:01 a.m. My heart rate spiked. The rules screamed in my mind. If you hear knocking on the door after midnight, do not answer. No one will come this far at that hour. The same pattern, but louder now. I stared at the office door, watching the old iron latch rattle slightly with each impact. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. The absence of its howl made the knocking seem even louder, more insistent. Then came the voice, a low, rasping whisper that barely rose above the silence, yet somehow filled the entire room. "James, let me in." I backed away from the door, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. That voice, I knew it. It was impossible, but I knew it. It belonged to my brother Michael, who had disappeared off the coast of Norway 2 years ago. His body had never been found. "James, please. I'm so cold out here. Just let me in." My brother's voice, exactly as I remembered it, down to the slight catch in his throat when he was upset. But Michael was gone. I'd identified his personal effects when they washed ashore: his wallet, his watch, his wedding ring. "Jimmy," the nickname he'd used since we were kids. "Jimmy, why won't you help me?" Something scratched at the door, a slow, dragging sound like fingernails on wood. The latch began to turn, metal grinding against metal with excruciating slowness. I watched, paralyzed, as it lifted a fraction of an inch, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No breathing from the other side of the door, no footsteps retreating. Nothing. Just the weight of something waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, muscles cramped from tension, watching that latch. Hours, maybe. The first hint of dawn was touching the horizon when I finally found the courage to approach the door. There were new marks on the wood, deep grooves that spelled out words in my brother's handwriting. "I'm still drowning, Jimmy. Every day, I'm still drowning." Below the words was a perfect impression of his hand, the same hand I'd shaken at the dock the morning he left for his last voyage. But the fingers were wrong, stretched and distorted, like those in the handprints on the glass. I spent the rest of the night researching the lighthouse's history on my failing laptop. In the past century, 17 ships had wrecked on the rocks below. In each case, survivors reported seeing lights on the cliffs, hearing familiar voices calling them toward the rocks. The lighthouse's beam, they said, had seemed to guide them straight into disaster. The dawn came reluctantly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to illuminate what lurked in the darkness. The sky was streaked with ash-gray clouds, and a pale, watery light barely pierced the horizon. My hands shook as I checked my calendar. It was the 1st of the month. The rule echoed in my mind. Once a month, leave an offering of fresh bread and milk on the cliff's edge at sunrise. Do not look back while walking away. I hadn't slept after the night's events. The memory of Michael's voice, the scratches in his handwriting, they'd kept me awake, huddled in the corner of the office with my back against the wall. But rules were rules, and something told me breaking this one would be worse than facing whatever waited outside. The unease from the previous night lingered as I prepared the offering in the lighthouse's small kitchen. The bread was from my meager supplies, slightly stale but serviceable. I'd found the tin pitcher in a cupboard, its surface dulled with age but still intact. The milk inside caught what little light filtered through the window, its surface gleaming faintly like mother of pearl. As I gathered the items, I noticed something odd about the pitcher. Tiny engravings around its rim that looked like waves. But as I looked closer, I realized they were actually hundreds of miniature faces, mouths open in silent screams. The path to the cliff's edge seemed longer than usual. The mist clung to my legs like a living thing, curling around my ankles and seeping through my clothes. It carried the scent of salt and decay, and something else. A sweet, cloying smell that reminded me of the flowers at Michael's memorial service. Each step was more precarious than the last. The rocks were slick with morning dew, and the mist made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The crashing waves below were muffled, as though the fog itself was swallowing the sound. As I reached the cliff's edge, the wind died suddenly, and the air grew heavy and thick. The sea stretched endlessly before me, a flat expanse of gray-green water that seemed unnaturally still. No waves, no movement, just a vast mirror reflecting the colorless sky above. I placed the bread and milk on the rocks, my hands trembling. The pitcher made a hollow sound as it touched the stone, like a bell rung underwater. The bread seemed to darken the moment it left my hands, as though it was aging rapidly in the salt air. "Don't look back," I whispered to myself, the rule repeating in my mind like a mantra. I turned, each movement feeling like I was fighting against an invisible current. The wind picked up again, but it carried more than just the usual ocean sounds. Whispers, dozens of them, overlapping and unintelligible, but insistent. My skin crawled as I fought the urge to glance over my shoulder. Then one voice rose above the others, clear as a bell. "James, why are you leaving us?" Michael's voice again, but not alone this time. Behind it, I could hear others. Our father, who died when we were young. Our grandmother. My high school friend who drowned at the beach. All calling my name, all asking why I wouldn't stay. I stopped, my breath hitching. My feet wavered, every muscle screaming to turn around. The voices grew more desperate, more pleading. Something brushed against my back, light as a feather but cold as ice. But I remembered the rules. I forced myself forward, one step at a time, even as the whispers turned to wails of despair. When I finally reached the lighthouse door, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like cotton in my ears. Hours later, when I couldn't stand not knowing any longer, I returned to the cliff. The offering was gone. Not a crumb of bread, not a drop of milk remained. But carved into the rocks where I'd left them were deep grooves that formed words. "Thank you, little brother. See you next month." Below the words was the image of a lighthouse, rendered in perfect detail. But in its windows were faces, dozens of them, pressed against the glass, looking out at the sea with hollow eyes. The sixth night started deceptively peacefully. The wind was gentle, almost playful, and the waves below had settled into a rhythmic lull. I sat in the keeper's office, surrounded by stacks of old maintenance records I'd been using to distract myself. My watch read 2:47 a.m. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, I found myself questioning whether I'd been overreacting. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe I was seeing patterns where there were only coincidences. The logical part of my mind tried to explain away the handprints, the voices, the carvings in the rocks. After all, lighthouses were known for playing tricks on their keepers' minds. The Maritime Board's manual had a whole section on maintaining psychological equilibrium in isolated conditions. I glanced at the barometer. It hadn't moved since I arrived, its needle frozen at fair despite the constantly changing weather. But as I watched, the needle twitched slightly, then began to drop rapidly. The glass face frosted over, despite the warmth of the room. Then, at precisely 3:05 a.m., the light went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, crushing. The familiar hum of the machinery died, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The rules flashed in my mind. If the light goes out between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., stay absolutely still until it comes back on. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The darkness pressed against my eyes like a physical weight. My watch ticked loudly in the silence. 3:06 a.m., 9 more minutes to endure. Then came the footsteps. They started at the bottom of the tower, soft and deliberate. Not the heavy boots of a maintenance worker or the hurried steps of someone coming to help. These were slow, measured, almost delicate. Each step was followed by a slight dragging sound, like something being pulled across the metal stairs. 3 a.m. The footsteps reached the first landing. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the desk under my fingers. The windows rattled slightly, though there was no wind. 3:10 a.m., second landing. The dragging sound was louder now, accompanied by a wet sliding noise that made my stomach turn. The darkness seemed to thicken, if that was possible. I could feel it pressing against my skin, probing, searching. The air took on a heavy, metallic taste that reminded me of blood. 3:12 a.m. The footsteps stopped just outside the office door. The handle began to rattle. I clenched my teeth, every muscle in my body rigid with fear. My watch seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Tick, tick, tick. Then a voice, my voice, whispered from the other side. "James, let me in. I need your help." The words were mine, but the tone was wrong. It was like hearing a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. Behind it, I could hear other voices, dozens of them, all whispering my name in that same distorted way. 3:13 a.m. The handle turned fully, but the door didn't open. Instead, something pressed against it, making the wood creak and bend inward. In the darkness, I could see the door bulging as if something massive was trying to force its way through. I kept absolutely still, remembering the rules. My legs cramped from tension, and sweat froze on my forehead despite the cold. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the light flickered back to life. The footsteps retreated, faster now, almost fleeing, and the temperature began to rise. When the door finally swung open on its own, the hallway was empty. But something had changed. The light from the lantern room above seemed different, dimmer somehow, and tinged with a subtle greenish hue that reminded me of deep water. And in its beam, I could see that the walls of the office were now covered in tiny handprints, as if made by children's hands. When I checked the maintenance log later, I found an entry from exactly 100 years ago. Third time this month, the light has gone out at 3 a.m. Each time, they get closer to breaking through. God help the keeper who lets them in. After 6 days of following the rules, of resisting every urge to understand what was happening, I finally broke. The logbook, the one I was specifically forbidden to touch, called to me from its hiding place beneath the desk. Something about last night's events had pushed me past the point of caution. I needed answers more than I needed safety. My hands trembled as I pulled it from its resting place. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, its surface marked with strange patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The binding was secured with a brass clasp that was ice cold to the touch, despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the window. The moment I broke the seal, The air in the room changed. The sunlight dimmed, and that coppery smell, the one I'd noticed on my first day, grew stronger. From somewhere deep in the lighthouse, I heard the foghorn give a single, quiet moan, like a warning. The first pages were exactly what you'd expect from a lighthouse log: neat columns of dates, times, weather conditions, ship sightings, maintenance records. But as I turned the pages, things began to change. The handwriting became more erratic, the entries less professional. Entry from 1912. The fog is alive. It moves with purpose, and I swear I saw something inside it. A shape. Watching. It stands at the edge of the light's reach, always just out of clear view. The other keepers say I'm seeing things, but I know what I saw. It had my wife's face, but wrong somehow. She's been dead for 3 years. The ink on this entry was brown and flaking, and the paper felt damper than it should. Entry from 1943. The knocking started again last night. It was louder this time, more insistent. They're using new voices now, the men from the fishing boat that went down last week. I can hear them drowning, over and over, begging me to let them in. I fear I won't last much longer. The rules are the only thing keeping them out, but my resolve is weakening. Sometimes I think I see my own face in the crowd outside. This entry was written in what looked like green-black seaweed ink, the words slightly raised on the page. Entry from 1977. I broke the rule. I looked back at the offering. It saw me. It knows my name now. They all know my name. They're in the mirrors, in the windows, in every reflection, always smiling, always waving, always drowning. The light doesn't keep them out anymore. It draws them in. We were wrong about its purpose. So wrong. The writing here was shaky, desperate. The pages were stained with what looked like salt water, and small handprints marked the margins. But it was the final entry that made my blood freeze. To the next keeper, the light isn't for the ships. It's for them. If it goes out, they'll come, and they will take you. Like they took us. All of us. Every keeper before you. We're still here, you see. Still watching. Still keeping the light. But not for the ships. Never for the ships. P.S. You should have followed the rules, James. Now you've read this, you're one of us. Or you will be. When the light goes out. The entry was dated tomorrow. As I stared at the impossible date, I noticed something else. My own reflection in the brass fittings of the logbook. But my face was all wrong. My eyes were dark pools of seawater, and my smile was too wide, filled with things that looked like fish bones. The foghorn blew in the distance, once, twice, 3 times. I slammed the book shut, but I could still feel it pulsing in my hands, like a living heart. And somewhere, far below, I heard the first footstep on the spiral staircase. The final night began like the ending of a nightmare, except I couldn't wake up. The foghorn blared its warning across the dark waters, once, twice, 3 times. I held my breath, clutching the cursed logbook to my chest, knowing what would come next. The 4th blast came, longer, louder, more guttural than ever before. It didn't sound like machinery anymore. It sounded like the lighthouse itself was screaming. I ran up the spiral staircase toward the lantern room, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The steps felt wrong under my feet, softer somehow, as if the metal had become organic, pulsing with each step. Water trickled down the walls, but it moved upward instead of down, defying gravity. When I reached the lantern room, my heart nearly stopped. The glass was smeared with handprints, hundreds of them, overlapping and writhing as though they were alive. They weren't just pressed against the glass. They were moving, shifting, fingers elongating and contracting like sea anemones. I recognized some of them: the delicate fingers of my grandmother, the scarred palm of my father, the small hands of the children from the fishing boat that sank in '98. The knocking started again, but this time it came from everywhere. Every door, every window, every surface of the lighthouse resonated with that rhythmic pounding. It was frantic, desperate, deafening. The very air seemed to vibrate with the force of it. I tried to barricade myself in the lantern room, dragging the old maintenance chest against the door. The logbook pulsed in my hands like a living heart, its pages fluttering open by themselves, revealing new entries written in script that dripped and moved across the page. Welcome home, James. You're almost one of us now. The light is fading, brother. The massive lens began to rotate faster than it should, its beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. But with each sweep, the light grew dimmer, and the darkness between beams grew longer. In those moments of blackness, I saw them, shapes moving in the glass, pressing through like bodies under thin ice. The shadows in the room began to move, pooling together into a single towering figure. It was like looking at a hole in the world, a space where reality simply stopped. But its voice, God, its voice was unmistakable. You've broken the rules, James. It's time to join us. Michael's voice, but not just his. Behind it were hundreds of others, all speaking in unison, all calling my name. I backed away, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. The figure reached out with fingers like twisted coral, brushing the edge of the great lens. Where it touched, the glass frosted over instantly, patterns of ice spreading like fractured webs. The light flickered once, twice, and went out. In that last moment of darkness, I saw my reflection in the glass. But it wasn't me anymore. The face staring back had eyes like the depths of the ocean, a mouth full of coral and seaweed, skin that rippled like the surface of dark water. It smiled at me with my brother's smile, reached for me with hands that had written in that logbook for over 100 years. The light was never for the ships, it whispered in 1,000 voices. It was to keep us in. When the Maritime Board finally investigated 2 weeks later, they found the lighthouse empty. The logbook was gone, the lantern glass shattered. Deep, claw-like gouges marked every wall, spelling out words in dozens of different hands. Home at last. The lighthouse remains dark now, deemed too dangerous for automated conversion. But locals tell stories of strange lights on the cliffs at night, and some swear they've heard voices, low, desperate, and faintly familiar, calling from the fog. They say if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can hear someone calling out across the water, "James, let me in." But it's not just one voice anymore. It's hundreds, all speaking together, all keeping their eternal watch over the dark waters of Oronce Light. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, ships report seeing a figure in the lighthouse window. A keeper, they say, still maintaining his post. But those who look too long notice something strange about his movements, something fluid and wrong, like a man moving underwater. They say he waves to passing ships, inviting them closer to shore. And sometimes, if the fog is thick and the night is dark enough, they say his smile stretches just a little too wide, filled with things that glisten like fish scales in the dark. After all, there must always be a keeper at Oronce Light. The rules demand it. And we all follow the rules here, don't we, James?